Why alligator?
Because
It's one of your maxims.
Feeding the alligators in the hopes that you won't be eaten.
You'll be the last to be eaten. All right.
And so that was, the Michigan Business Pack Watch achieved its purpose in kind of drying up the funds. Another thing we did with Lou Dodak was that we put up a billboard right on the Birch Run exit of I-75 that Lou Dodak would take each night to go home. And in our billboard, we basically said, "Don't sign don't sign Speaker Dodak's petition. Otherwise, we had, I think, under Blanchard, it was jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, we had this kind of universal slash sign." And a no jobs, no jobs, no jobs. And so don't sign his petition. And so Lou would have to see that every time he pulled off the 75 exit. As it turned out, with the adoption of the Lazinski plan,
the redistricting
plan. His own state house district was much more marginal. And in fact, in 1992, he was defeated for re-election and was no longer the Speaker of the House. So that gave me some satisfaction. But what we did do is we retained Tom Shields at MRG, who hired somebody for her first political job, and that was Terry Reed, who until recently had been one of the top advisors in the Snyder gubernatorial office dealing with kind of political activities, and then Peerage to challenge the sufficiency of signatures. And back in 1992, if you could demonstrate that a circulator of a petition was not a registered voter in Michigan, that's no longer the case today, but back in 1992 it was, then you could regardless of the validity of the signature, you could get all those struck because the circulator of the petition was not a registered voter. And Tom and John had devised a mechanism for basically checking the voter registration status of all of these circulators, and we found enough signatures that were invalid that it didn't there was insufficient signatures to qualify it for the 1992 ballot.
Okay, what about 2008?
This was a very interesting issue, and in fact, as I look back professionally, it was perhaps my most satisfying, because in early June we had no idea this petition drive even existed. Mark Brewer, bless his soul, basically conducted a stealth petition drive. They had been working on this issue since 2007.
This is the Michigan Democratic Party, Mark Brewer.
Yeah, they had hired the Byram Fisk's firm to do a lot of work on this. They hired pollsters, focus groups, but they didn't take their petition to the State Board of Canvassers to get their petition approved as to form. They just began their petition drive. And I caught wind of this because I had been, looking at some newspapers. The Jackson Citizen Patriot talked about petition circulators spreading out in downtown Jackson, during the lunch hour. And then some guy in Mount Pleasant did a story with the Sun up there and said that he was approached by someone at the post office about this to signing a petition, and he said it cuts legislative salaries, but they were very reluctant to talk about who was behind the plan or anything like that. So someone got a hold of the petition. It got its way to Solonousis at the state Republican headquarters.
Solonousis was a Republican
state chairman back in 2008. And Saul did a YouTube on it. And what was interesting about the petition is that, it folded down to 8.5 by 14. But as you unfolded it, it all of a sudden grew geometrically to the point where it was bigger than the state of Michigan roadmap. And on both sides of the sheet of paper in 8-point type were like 34 changes to the Michigan Constitution. And, you know, the legislature had substantial changes made to it, the executive office and the judiciary. We were faced with a conundrum here. This thing was just weeks away from getting filed. We had no money. What were we going to do? And Jim Barrett was going to be leaving the presidency of the Michigan Chamber of Commerce at the end of the month. Well, we made the decision that we had to fight this thing. So whatever money we were prepared to spend on issue ads and whatever money we were prepared to spend on redistricting coming up in 2011, we decided we had to spend now to keep this thing off the ballot. One of the things it did on the Supreme Court is it downsized the Supreme Court from 7 justices to 5. The 2 justices with the least seniority, Markman and Young, would be off the court at the end of the year if this thing passed.
Who are both Republicans.
Right. And then on the Court of Appeals, I think 6 or 8 judges on the Court of Appeals, all the judges that were up in 2010 would be ineligible to run for re-election under the terms of this, so I guess 8 of them. And 7 out of the 8 were Republicans, and the one Democrat, Helena White, had already been appointed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, so she wouldn't be yelling and screaming about it. And then it would increase the size of the circuit courts around the state by 10 additional judges, all to be appointed by the governor. And then they were going to cut all sorts of judicial pay by 25%, so that would lead to a stampede of early retirements. And then, as far as the legislature was concerned, they would downsize the state Senate from 38 seats down to 28. They would downsize the State House of Representatives from 110 to 82, and because they downsized it, in order to have elections in 2010, they'd have to have a redistricting of the state legislature. And they would create a kind of independent redistricting commission and come up with different standards than APOL. And so we knew that this was the real deal.
You could describe this as a sweeping proposal, right?
That's
revolutionary almost.
So anyway, we made the decision that we were going to spend the money now, take the money out of the redistricting fund, take the money out of our issue advocacy account, and hire lawyers. And I knew that this was a project that had to be done very quickly, and it was probably much too much for one law firm. So we hired Peter Ellsworth and Jeff Stuckey at Dickinson Wright to do the challenge, the constitutional challenge. We hired Pirich and Andrea Hansen to do the sufficiency challenge on signatures and circulators, and then we hired Gary Gordon and have him basically argue before the State Board of Canvassers that you couldn't explain something with this breadth in 100 words. And I did come up with an idea that I shared with Peter Ellsworth, and I said, you know, the Constitution makes provision for constitutional amendments. They can either be put on the ballot by the legislature with a 2/3 vote of both chambers, or a constitutional amendment can be initiated by voters through a petition drive that would collect signatures equal to 10% of the total vote cast for governor in the last election. There may, in fact, not be any real restrictions on the scope of an amendment. I mean, there is no provision in Michigan, like there is in some other states, that a constitutional amendment can only deal with a single subject. So we needed to come up with a different theory. And I said to Peter, how's this for a theory? You know, the Constitution in Article 12 provides for a general revision of the Michigan Constitution through a constitutional convention with elected delegates. And frankly, what we have here is Mark Brewer trying to do a constitutional convention in his basement by making all these wide-sweeping changes to all three branches of government. And maybe that's how we attack this thing. Well, in essence, that's basically what we ended up doing, is attacking it as a general revision of the Michigan Constitution rather than just an amendment to the Michigan Constitution. We went to the Michigan Court of Appeals, got a writ of mandamus out of the Michigan Court of Appeals.
And what does that mean?
That means that basically that the court is ordering the State Board of Canvassers not to certify this question for the ballot.